Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We all want to learn and grow, but sometimes it feels like too much, information overload. So today we're going to take one really powerful idea and unpack it so we can actually use it.
Absolutely. And, it's a strategy that a lot of people overlook, actually.
Yeah.
It's this idea of winning big by thinking small.
Ooh, I like that.
We're digging into Strategy 29, Take Small Bites, the Fait, Accompli strategy. It's from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War. And it really flips the script on what we think about as, traumatic action and bold moves and things like that.
Okay, so fait accompli. I mean, that just sounds kind of like a spy thriller thing. What's the core idea here?
Well, it's basically about making the outcome that you want inevitable by completing it in such small stages that nobody really notices enough to resist at any point.
Okay.
The idea is tiny steps don't really trigger those alarm bells, but together they build this force that's very hard to stop.
So you're basically making it so by the time people realize what you've done, it's too late to even do anything about it.
Exactly. Each small win kind of builds this foundation for the next.
Okay.
And you end up with this cumulative effect that's almost impossible to reverse.
Okay, so for our listener,
Yeah.
right, we hear all the time about, the importance of like bold action. Why does this strategy of these small, almost unseen moves, why does this often actually win out in the long run?
I think the fundamental reason is there's less friction.
Okay.
Big actions, aggressive actions, those really put people on guard. They feel like they need to defend their territory, their ideas, whatever they have, right?
Right.
Small moves, though, they kind of slip under the radar and they don't trigger that same defensive reaction. By the time the bigger picture becomes clear, it's almost like, well, we're already here. It's too hard to change it.
Yeah. It's like slowly turning up the thermostat in a room.
Yeah,
No one really notices a 1 degree change, but over time, the whole room is warmer.
exactly. Exactly.
So this isn't just theoretical, right? History is full of examples.
Mhm.
Um, let's start with the Roman Empire. We think of conquest. But their expansion had this really subtle side to it, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Rome didn't grow through these like massive land grabs all of a sudden. It was a much slower, more deliberate process. I mean, we're talking decades, centuries even. They weren't constantly at war, they were playing the long game. And I think that's the big takeaway for our listeners, seeing how taking small bites can lead to really, really huge power.
So what do these small bites actually look like for the Romans? What were some of their go-to moves?
Well, the sources highlight all kinds of things, right? Like one thing they were really good at was establishing trade routes, sending merchants out, creating these economic links.
Hmm.
They were masters of alliances too. They'd gradually bring neighboring groups into their political system.
Okay.
And their infrastructure, things like roads, that was crucial.
Yeah.
It helped with commerce, but it also eventually facilitated troop movements. Right. So it was subtle. And then importantly, they integrated local elites, gave them incentives, Roman citizenship, things like that, slowly zipping those conquered populations into the empire itself.
It sounds less, like you said, a hostile takeover and more like slow integration.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time these regions fully realized they were under Roman control, they were already kind of used to it. They were benefiting from it.
They were reliant on that Roman system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So resisting it just became like a huge uphill battle.
Exactly. It wasn't this sudden, shocking thing. It was this very long process that actually led to a much more lasting empire,
Right.
than one based purely on just military power. And I think the lesson for you, listener, is the power of that slow, integrated action to create dominance that really lasts.
That's a great point. Now let's jump forward a bit in history. Contemporary example, China's global expansion.
Mhm.
How are they using this small bite strategy today?
What's really interesting is, China's been expanding their influence mostly through economics and politics,
Mhm.
not so much direct military force, right?
Yeah.
They've been very strategic about building relationships, making trade agreements, investments all around the world. And this has, real implications for you listening because, these kinds of global shifts affect everything from your investments to, what's available to buy in stores.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. It's kind of like how Rome built those dependencies through trade and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like China's doing it now, but with economic ties.
Hmm.
Is that kind of the parallel here?
It's exactly the parallel. They're fostering this deep economic interdependence, to the point where lots of nations are now relying on China for trade and investment, which means, challenging China could have a really significant economic impact on those countries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's this quiet accumulation of power that has led to a really significant global position. And I think, the big takeaway for you is that quiet growth can lead to a very strong and unshakable position on a global scale.
It's the same principle, right?
Uh,
Grow your influence gradually, establish those connections. By the time people realize the full extent of your reach,
yeah.
it's really hard to push back without, a serious cost.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is not just about, empires and superpowers, right? Like, how can our listener take this small bites strategy and use it to reach goals in their own life?
Right. That's where this really becomes relevant for you.
Yeah.
Think about, any big goal that
Yeah.
you want to achieve instead of trying to do the whole thing all at once, which, let's be honest, a lot of times feels overwhelming and then leads to us doing nothing at all.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Break it down. Break it down into much smaller steps. Each small step, if you do it consistently, gets you closer to that objective without triggering that same level of resistance, whether that's your own internal resistance from feeling overwhelmed or resistance from, other people who might not want you to succeed.
Yeah. So if you want to learn a new skill, don't try to master it in a week.
Right.
Focus on one small aspect each day. If you want to get in shape, start with short walks. Don't try to run a marathon right away. Just those small, consistent actions that don't feel daunting, they add up.
Exactly. It allows you to build momentum, feel accomplished along the way, and those small wins reinforce your progress and actually make it more sustainable. The changes are so subtle that you don't trigger those internal alarm bells or the potential resistance from others who might be, comfortable with the way things are now.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big takeaway for you. Breaking down big goals makes them much less intimidating and much more achievable.
Yeah, I love that. The text also gives us a warning, though, right? Like, avoid aggressive, sudden moves,
Right.
which makes perfect sense given what we're talking about, right?
Well, yeah, the source makes it very clear that sudden, aggressive actions, they almost always provoke a strong reaction. And if you try to take too much too quickly, people are going to push back. And that is the opposite of the whole point of the Fait Accompli strategy. It's all about avoiding that resistance in the first place.
Right.
Big leaps often invite big pushback.
So they give a historical example to illustrate this, right?
Yeah.
Nazi Germany's early expansion. Hitler initially took these very calculated, seemingly small steps.
Yeah.
Can you kind of walk us through that and what's the insight for us there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember that leading up to World War II, Hitler didn't just launch into a huge global war all at once. He started with what seemed like smaller actions, remilitarizing the Rhineland, annexing Austria, taking parts of Czechoslovakia. Each move, looking back now, they were significant, but at the time they didn't trigger this immediate, unified military response from other European powers. So for you, the big takeaway is that step-by-step expansion can be a lot harder to resist than one big outright attack.
It's like a slow creep,
Yeah.
testing the boundaries, taking small gains. And by the time the world really understood what he was doing, he'd already built up a significant military.
Hmm.
And he was already in these key strategic locations.
Yeah, and each step made the next one easier.
Right.
And Germany just got stronger and stronger. So by the time, the Allied powers decided they had to do something, Germany was already a much, much tougher opponent. And it's a really, it's a dark example, but it shows how this strategy, this gradual step-by-step expansion is really hard to counter. And the big lesson is that subtle, incremental gains, they can build huge power, for good or for bad.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that this strategy could be used, for very different ends. But the text also warns us about another danger, even within the approach itself, greed.
Right.
Right. You can be taking small bites, but you can still overreach.
Yeah. And that's a really important point to understand. This Fait Accompli strategy relies on those moves you make feeling almost natural and unavoidable. If you start taking too much, even if it's in stages, people are going to notice.
Yeah.
They're going to start to see what you're doing and they're going to push back. And that's exactly what you're trying to avoid.
Right.
So there's this delicate balance. The takeaway for you is that even small steps, they got to feel organic, not overly aggressive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we have a modern example of this with Facebook. They bought Instagram, they bought WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Seemingly small moves, very strategic. They strengthened their position in social media. But then came Libra, right?
Right. I mean, the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, those were big in the long run. But at the time, they kind of made sense in the social media world. But Libra, the cryptocurrency, that was totally different.
Yeah.
It was this huge leap into a whole other sector. And that's what triggered this huge pushback from governments.
Right.
They saw it as this big power grab. So I think the takeaway for you is overreaching, even with smaller steps, can still get you in trouble.
It was a bite that was too big,
Yeah.
too disruptive,
Mhm.
and it happened too fast.
Exactly. The earlier moves, those hadn't caused that same level of resistance. So
Well,
it's about keeping those individual bites small enough that they don't raise any red flags. The goal is to get yourself into a strong position before anyone can really organize against you.
right.
So yeah, the lesson is make sure your steps aren't too ambitious, too threatening.
Okay, so let's, synthesize this a little bit for our listener.
Yeah.
If we want to actually use this strategy in our lives, what are some concrete steps to take while avoiding those pitfalls of aggression and greed?
All right, so a few key things to remember. First, commit to making small, consistent progress towards whatever it is you want to achieve.
Okay.
Don't try to do everything at once.
Right.
Second, try to operate a little bit under the radar. Advance your goals quietly without drawing a ton of attention.
Okay.
Third, establish your control, your progress incrementally. Make sure each step just feels like the natural next thing.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth, be patient. This is a long game strategy.
Yeah.
Rushing things can backfire big time.
Right.
And finally, consolidate each gain before you move on to the next.
Okay.
Don't overextend yourself, don't try to juggle too many things at once.
Yeah, focus.
Focus, yeah. Steady, understated progress.
I like that.
That's the foundation of this whole approach.
Okay. And, we see this in another really great example in business, Amazon.
Yeah.
They started out as, this online bookstore, kind of a small bite in the grand scheme of retail.
Right.
But look at them now.
Well, what's amazing about Amazon is how they've expanded into all these different areas, electronics, cloud computing with AWS, entertainment, their own delivery network.
Crazy.
It's crazy. And each step was gradual. And by the time the traditional retailers, really woke up to what was happening, it was almost impossible to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
So for you listening, the insight is seeing how quietly building in multiple areas can lead to this, unstoppable force.
It was just this slow, relentless, almost like this wave, sector by sector, not through some big revolution, just, step by step, strategic, incremental.
Exactly. And, they basically won before a lot of their competitors even knew what game they were playing. And I think that's a really great illustration of building quietly and achieving immense power. So the lesson is a series of smaller, well-planned moves. They can add up to something truly monumental.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Take Small Bites, the message is clear. Real power, lasting success, it often comes from this consistent, gradual progress. The most effective people, the most effective organizations, they don't make those big, splashy moves that invite resistance. They take the smaller, almost invisible steps that over time lead to a position that no one can challenge.
That's right. It's about having that long-term perspective, building momentum steadily, deliberately.
So I want you to think about your own goals.
Mm-hmm.
Think about your own aspirations. Are you making moves that are triggering pushback? Or are you strategically taking small bites towards that inevitable success that you want? Mastering this art of gradual progress might be the key to those really enduring victories, the ones that no one can take away from you.
And it really begs the question, what's that small, seemingly insignificant step that you can take today? The one that will contribute to something much, much bigger down the road. Think about that. Appreciate the power of that slow, steady climb.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. See you next time.
See you then.